My name's James Richardson. I am the Research and Innovation Manager at an organisation called Tinder Foundation. A couple of bits of my own housekeeping before we get started. We will be talking about longitudinal analysis today, and I put that in 5 minutes ago. It ended up being the title of the talk as it was advertised. It's something we do, it's something we'll talk about, and I'm happy to field any number of questions about it. But I'm also going to be talking about some other things that we do and some other general considerations about research in a third sector practice organisation like the one I work for. It's highly unlikely. If I get a message from my partner saying she's gone into labour, I might have to leave immediately. Her due date is not until next Tuesday, so, touch wood, we will be okay. This is my second year coming to Methods at Manchester, so thank you very much to Rebecca and the rest of the Methods at Manchester team for inviting me back. We had a very good time last year. We've got slightly more people this year, which is a hallmark of success, I think. And as you will see, I think it's extremely important that the connections between academia and the third sector in terms of research continue to be built. So in detail what we're covering, I'm going to explain a little bit about our organisation, who we are and what we're trying to achieve, and why research is important to help us to achieve it, but also some specific problems as to why research is not always as easy to implement in the third sector as you might expect. I want to give you a few examples of what we're doing and what's working in practice. That will include our longitudinal study. I want to play you a short video. I've only just decided that, but it sort of quite nicely sums up our work. And then I'll take questions. I'd be very happy to take the questions. And then finally, we've got a workshop at the end where we're going to look at a couple of real life examples, and I'd be very interested to hear what you think about these projects, what kind of research questions you'd like to answer, and what you think should be the considerations for research in practice based on some of the things that I'm going to tell you. If you need to get away early, that's absolutely fine. Tinder Foundation is nothing to do with a dating agency. We, with incredible timing, decided to change our name just before the Tinder app really took off. So we are Tinder Foundation and definitely not Tinder, which we have to explain any number of times a week to various people. We are a charitable social enterprise and a not-for-profit. We're based in Sheffield. We have always been charitable in outlook, but we have recently become a registered charity because it opens the door to more funding and it helps building partnerships, that kind of thing. We receive our funding from a number of different sources, the largest chunk of which is from central government, so the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, NHS England, the Department for Communities and Local Government, to do a variety of things, mostly with a focus around different aspects of digital inclusion, which I'll explain a bit more in a moment, but increasingly our remit is more to do with wider social inclusion issues as well. And I will explain more about that in a moment. We're a second tier organisation, which means that we receive large amounts of funding and we disperse it to practitioners working on the ground, and as well as dispersing funding, we also provide support services to our network in terms of advice, training, providing digital learning tools, that kind of thing. The network consists of 3,000 what are called UK online centres. They're a very mixed bunch, and I'll explain a little bit more about them in a moment. But the most important things to know about them is that they are what we call hyperlocal organisations. They tend to be small and working in the heart of disadvantaged communities. They're spread across the UK, and no two are the same is probably the best way to put it. Digital exclusion. Has anyone heard of the phrase digital exclusion before? Great, we're making progress. Okay. Digital exclusion means exclusion from digital technology. So it's a lack of skills, a lack of motivation, a lack of access, a lack of confidence, what you will. I put in a couple of slides. They're sort of standard slides I use with, this many million people are digitally excluded, and that breaks down as, this many older people, this proportion of unemployed people, and so you go. But I do that an awful lot, and I just decided to delete them, which might seem a little bit reckless. But one of the things that struck me when I was pulling these slides together and updating the numbers, is the latest number for digital exclusion in the UK is 12.6 million people don't have what are considered to be basic, fundamental, functional digital skills. When I presented this last year, the figure was 10.5 million, and that's not because 2.1 million people have forgotten everything they ever knew about the internet. It's because the definition of skills has changed. You might make some interesting observations about what possible motivation the digital inclusion practice sector has for massaging the numbers upwards. But I think the more interesting thing is that by focusing on the numbers become what matter. So digital skills becomes seen as, the lack of digital skills becomes to be seen as the only problem, and providing those skills becomes to be seen as the only solution. On the grounds that nobody's heard of it, it's worth stating what would appear to be pretty obvious. The large majority of people who are digitally excluded, however you precisely define it, are older people who did not grow up with technology. It also correlates strongly with poverty, not having English as a first language, living in rural areas. You can understand the implications for access, connectivity, growing up in circumstances where educational achievement is not high. So that's what digital exclusion is. But I think the important points here are that there's a lot of disagreement about what the numbers are, and I think as an organisation we're trying to move away from focusing just on the numbers and how many people have what particular skills. For me, the most important and interesting fact about digital exclusion is that it's closely related to social exclusion. So these are figures from our ongoing survey from our population of learners across the UK Online Centres network. 50% of our learners are educated but at low level 2, nearly a third are unemployed, nearly 2/3 are in receipt of means tested benefits, just over a third live in social or sheltered housing or are homeless, and just over a quarter are in HBAI, households below average income, that stands for relative income poverty. So the important point here is that people who need help with digital skills, people who don't have essential digital skills or access or confidence or motivation, are also more likely to need help with things like functional skills, literacy and numeracy, with English language skills if they're non-native English speakers, with employability skills, and more generally with help with finding work, and with things like financial and welfare advice. These figures, by the way, are pretty constant over the last several years. So there's a very strong correlation between digital and social exclusion, and the extent to which one causes or is affected by the other is a matter of some debate. If you don't have a job, you're more likely to be in poverty, and I think it's obviously extremely simplistic to suggest that being digitally excluded causes these problems in the first place, but being digitally excluded certainly doesn't help, and developing digital skills can obviously help people in certain circumstances. In terms of employability, having digital skills, being able to find and apply for jobs online can be extremely important. Overcoming loneliness and isolation in older people is a big part of what our centres do through things like Skype, Facebook, email, what have you. But also the important point is that if people are less likely to become digitally included if these issues aren't dealt with as well. If somebody turns up at your door and says, I don't have any shoes, probably the least helpful thing you can do is just give them a pair of shoes and send them on their way, because you're not dealing with the underlying causes of shoelessness. And I think this is what we're increasingly thinking about when people present at our centres saying that they need help with digital skills. It's looking at ways to support them across all aspects and all kinds of exclusion. I've really debated with myself about whether to include this picture or not, but it is indeed a vicious circle. Sorry. So over the last nearly 10 years now, we have recruited organisations across the UK into the UK Online Centres network, and the reason we've recruited them is because we wanted to tackle digital exclusion. That's what we were funded to do. But because the kind of centres that are good at tackling that are also good at tackling other kinds of social exclusion, we have almost by accident ended up with a network which is very good at helping socially excluded people in lots of different ways, very good at engaging with them as well. So when I say that it's our network, we don't own these centres, they're all independent organisations. Only a small majority of our network is funded by us, between 5 and 10% at a time. We like to fund more, but in these times of austerity, we simply don't have the money. So any one organisation in our network will only ever be part funded by us, maybe not funded by us at all. Being a UK Online Centre is much more a philosophical exercise. It's about having a commitment and an awareness of the problem of digital exclusion and how it should be overcome. We've got a very mixed bag of organisations. We have public libraries, we have social housing providers, not many of them, but through there they have tenant bases in the hundreds of thousands collectively, so we potentially have a huge amount of reach there. We have what you might call the standard model is community centres, which tend to be established in areas of poverty and deprivation, and which tend to have a few key characteristics. Firstly, they have an open door policy. You don't have to book, you don't have to be from a particular demographic. You just walk in and say, I need help with X, I heard I could get help with X, whether they've been formally referred or it's word of mouth or they've seen a leaflet. The door is open to anybody who wants help. Also, these organisations tend to be one-stop shops. They tend to provide a very broad service. They're not likely to say, well, we don't do this, we don't provide that kind of support. There's a lot of learning to provide support on the fly, and with the inevitable cuts to local support networks under austerity, a lot of these organisations are finding themselves having to fill in gaps that were previously provided by local authority support services or Citizens Advice Bureau or many other organisations which have had to withdraw their services or close completely. So, to give you an example of how this is working in practice, we were approached by HMRC last year, who wanted to fund an organisation who could provide welfare and benefits advice to some of their more severely socially excluded service users. This might be something that would traditionally be thought of as being paid for to fund Citizens Advice Bureau, for example. We won the bid, and we have funded some CAB who we've brought into our network as a result. But we've also funded a lot of organisations who provide the kind of broad spectrum support that I'm talking about. For example, refugee and asylum seeker support groups. A lot of the beneficiaries of the programme so far have been black and minority ethnic, have been families in poverty. And I think the important point to realise here is that in some cases these organisations are better placed to provide the right kind of support than organisations like Citizens Advice Bureau, and in some cases we have Citizens Advice Bureau referring to organisations like ours, saying, well, this person needs an accessible building, this person needs basic literacy and numeracy support, this person needs translation services which we can't provide. So by providing this kind of broad spectrum support, our centres are very, very good at meeting all these needs in one go. And one of the centres that we're funding through this programme put it to me quite well in a catch-up call. They said that you're talking about people who might have a lot of problems, some of which are quite complicated and distressing. They don't want to have to go and explain it to 5 different organisations, to 5 different agencies. They want one organisation that can solve all of their problems in one go. It's more efficient, and it means that you have to wander around less telling your problems to lots of different people. So that was just a bit of background about what we do. And this brings me on to why research is very, very important in the third sector in particular, and also for a broad spectrum support organisation like ours. Firstly, this kind of broad spectrum support model that I've been describing is not brilliantly understood. There is some good research going on. Birmingham University Third Sector Research Centre, for example, is doing a lot of work with these sort of smaller and what they call under the radar organisations. But traditionally, funders will fund individual projects. They'll fund somebody to tackle local level numeracy, loneliness and isolation among older people, social exclusion, youth unemployment, and when they ask for those projects to be evaluated, they will ask for them to be evaluated in isolation. They won't want to necessarily know how one form of support fits in with another form of support or is more efficient because other forms of support are offered. So there's a lot that still needs to be done to understand this model and what can be done at a national level to help it, to make it more effective. Also, because we've got a very mixed bag of centres, it helps us to understand how to segment the network, who can help with what, who would benefit from certain kinds of support and funding. It also helps to target our activities, to recruit new centres. So we might decide that we want to work on a particular social challenges strategy, and therefore we need to recruit more Citizens Advice Bureau or shelter supporting vulnerable women, for example, into the fold. And also, and I think this is a very important point, the view from the top isn't always clear. You need to be talking to practitioners on the ground about local needs, about circumstances that can change very, very rapidly due to changes in government policy or funding or immigration, out-migration. So research on the ground can be very, very beneficial. Also, we're trying to steer the people who give us money in the right direction. Funders can be a little bit obtuse in the criteria they place on us, and therefore place on the organisations that we fund. So, for example, for years now, funding for digital inclusion has always been about skills. You can pay for skills, you can pay for volunteer support time, you can pay for transport costs. You can't pay for equipment. You can't actually buy computers. Now, this is a problem because you need computers to teach people digital skills, and a lot of the time you've got volunteers lugging around 10-year-old laptops that weigh £8 or £9 a piece across rural parts of Britain, where they would probably benefit really from a nice new set of iPads. So by finding out what the problems are with delivering social inclusion programs on the ground, we can go back to funders and say, this is the kind of stuff you need to fund. This is what would help. Yeah, I've really gone to town with the pictures, I know. Research in the third sector can be extremely difficult. For a start, budgets tend to be very limited. You can be looking at the tens of thousands of pounds rather than hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions. Sometimes there is no dedicated budget for a research project at all. Also, another consideration is we're being given money to help people and to disperse money to organisations that help people, and any money for research has to be carved out from that. So there's a very careful balancing act to be struck where if you're taking money for research, you're potentially taking it away from a programme or a project that might be helping people on the ground. Funders don't often see the value. They might take the approach like, well, you can fill in our standard evaluation form, take a few photos for case studies, and that'll be fine by us. There is always the pressure to do more for less. Again, as a result of austerity, budgets tend to be cut year on year, targets tend to go up. So making the case for dedicated research time and budget is getting more and more difficult. There is the pressure or the expectation for the results to come out right. This happens at all levels. Even the funders above us have to justify to ministers why they're giving out money. So they want the results to come out a certain way. We want the results to come out a certain way. People working on the ground want the results to come out a certain way. And also for grassroots community organisations working on the ground, people are not paid very much. A lot of people are volunteers. There is a tendency to assume that what you're doing is the right thing to do because, otherwise why would you be doing it? So there's a bit of cognitive dissonance, a bit of built-in bias. It can be difficult to convince people that the right answer is not the easy answer or the answer that everybody wants to hear. A lot of methodologies don't work well in practice. RCTs, randomised control trials, are the new darling of some government departments, and we keep being asked to do them. The problem is it can be very, very difficult, very complicated to implement them through a second-tier organisation like ours. And also it involves things like potentially denying service to people, so you can have a control group, which our ground level delivery partners obviously aren't that keen on. Finally, timescales can be tight. I was approached by a PhD student well over a year ago now, and they were doing some work around digital health, which we do a great deal of. They were interested in seeing if their PhD could involve looking at a project, and we had a very useful discussion until it transpired that his deadline to apply for funding wasn't until after our entire project had finished, which gives you some idea of the difference between the timescales of academia and the timescales of practice organisations. That said, I think there are plenty of ways to make research work in practice. Partnership with academic institutions through awareness raising events like this, but also we work with the London School of Economics, we work with Oxford Internet Institute. There's a lot to be gained on both sides. Academics have access to our data, but they can also help to steer our projects. More recently, we started choosing projects that sort of foreground innovation and research, test and learn projects, action research projects, and I'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. Getting funders and stakeholders, both above us and below us, to understand that research is important, that methodologies are important, and that objectivity is important, rather than setting out with the idea that the answers should be a particular way. And making space and time for independent research. Third sector organisations should generate some independent income. They should have some money of their own to play with that isn't tied to a particular agenda. And this is less about making evaluation objective, which it should be anyway, but more about having the ability to set our own research questions. And that's where things like our longitudinal study come in, which I'll talk about in a moment. Finding methodologies that work in practice. For example, is anyone familiar with stepped wedge trials? Has anyone come across those? Stepped wedge trials are a form of RCT where an intervention is rolled out in stages. So there's no denial of service, but you get a control group, and it fits quite nicely the way that such programs tend to be rolled out in reality. And finally, using frontline expertise, we have our centres. A lot of them are older than we are. Some of them are older than the internet. And they've been working on the ground helping people in disadvantaged communities for a very, very long time. So they can be incredibly valuable sources of insight. We've had academics, policymakers, talking about some exciting findings, and I'll go and talk to managers of our centres working in deprived communities. They'll be like, "Oh, we've known that for years." That's obvious. So drawing on that expertise can be extremely powerful. To give you a couple of examples from real life, we are currently working with the University of Sheffield, who have a research project going at the moment called Space for Sharing, which is about the use of online health forums by people in a wide range of difficult circumstances. But we were interested because they were looking at how online health forums were used by people with long-term chronic and terminal health conditions. Obviously, such conditions are more likely to be experienced by older people. Older people are less likely to be able to use the internet. So what we organised a roundtable event bringing together the university, some of our national partners like Mind and Macmillan, and some ground level practitioners to talk about what we can do. We're now developing some online learning resources for people to help them understand the benefits of using these forums and how to use them, and also resources for staff and tutors in our centres. This is a bit more than just about digital skills. If you want to teach someone how to use email, it's relatively straightforward. Obviously, using something like an online health forum is more complicated. There are issues of confidentiality, issues of emotion, and the right kind of support to be provided. Another one of the research projects which would be interesting if you guys could look at in the workshop at the end is Reboot UK, which is an action research project funded by the Big Lottery Fund. We're working with specialist partners, working with homeless people, people with mental illness and families in poverty. And this is less about pure digital skills and more about finding ways that digital can be used innovatively to support these groups. And I think the important point is that, you know, what Big Lottery Fund want to find out, they don't want there to be a particular answer. They want to find ways in which projects could be scaled or expanded, and to find the best, you know, the best possible kinds of intervention. So there is no agenda. We also work with a number of different organisations commissioning, I say independent reports, semi-independent reports, where we have a great deal of input into data collection and analysis, financial capability using stepped wedge trials, which are rigorous but don't involve denial of service, and the ground level expertise that I talked about. We now have a network of centres who are our research partners, and they help with things like bid writing, they help with things like evidence in terms of how we support particular groups, for example job seekers, and are just generally on call to provide qualitative data and insight at short notice when we need it. Okay, this is the reason probably a number of you are here, so I'll talk about this in a bit more detail than I was originally going to. The way that our learners have been measured historically has been very much based on quantitative data. BIS, for example, fund us to get learners through a certain number of online learning modules, or centres can record learners' details and the kind of support they've received online, but it's very much about numbers. Qualitative data has historically been limited to case studies, sunshine stories, if you will, where it's all about the good news. It very much focuses on how wonderful the support from the centre is, and I'm not saying those things aren't true, and there are very important reasons why they should be promoted, but it doesn't necessarily help us to understand the complexity of the needs of our service users, or the complexity of the support that centres are providing to overcome those problems. So our longitudinal study was very much a new departure. We'd never done anything like it before, although we do have people with academic backgrounds on the research team who have done such studies in the past. So this is working through our research partner network, which I just mentioned. They helped us with the recruitment of 30 learners from a very wide range of backgrounds. We've got older people, younger people, people who are unemployed, unable to work due to disability or ill health. We have husbands and wives, people from different ethnic backgrounds. We've got a very mixed bunch. They're being interviewed 5 times over the full 18 months of the project, with 3 face-to-face interviews and 2 being recorded by Skype. We're using Cactus. Does anyone else use Cactus? So computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, which is kind of basically like a magic highlighter pen, but it's extremely useful for coding and then analysing interview transcripts. So I think the point of there are sort of 2 points of the longitudinal study. It's raising awareness to senior funders and senior partners about the complexity of the needs of the people we support. So saying to people, if you want to support us to overcome digital exclusion, you need to bear these things in mind as well. When I talked about the downward pressure of funding, as I said, our core funding has been from BIS for the last several years. Up until the beginning of the last financial year, we were funded at £30 per head. They then changed the contract at the beginning of this financial year. It's now a much longer contract, which gives us some financial stability, which is great. But our cost per head is now £15. In other words, it's been cut in half. Now, you don't have to know anything at all about the sector to understand that that's going to have massive implications for what can be achieved. However, targets remain high. The justifications for this funding being cut were not brilliantly thought out, shall we say. So there's a downward pressure on funding, and we're not going to be able to reverse the narrative. unless we provide some very rich, complex and compelling data about just how difficult and just how long term the job can be. The fact that these learners are going to be engaged with these centres over 18 months, or are probably going to be engaged with these centres over 18 months, we do expect a certain amount of dropout, people moving on, finding jobs, whatever it might be. But we have survey data which suggests that a lot of our learners attend centres for several months at least, that they attend for digital skills, but also for older people, for example, there's a lot of reason to attend around socialisation, meeting other people face to face. So there's something about understanding the model and communicating that to people who hold the purse strings. But also we very much want to be involved in independent original research. This is one of the things that we've carved out some budget for. It's not an official requirement. We don't have to say anything or prove anything to Biz or anybody else through this study. So we can objectively analyse and present this data. We'd like to be able to get some peer-reviewed journal articles out of it, which would be a first for us. And I don't know how much that happens in the third sector. It might be, it's very, very rare for an infrastructure organisation like ours to get into an academic journal. So that would be a good thing, I think. The interim findings, we're only one interview in to the study so far, but the interim findings have been extremely interesting. There are a lot of security concerns, as you might expect, but they tend to be stitched together from every bad news story that the participant has ever heard about the internet, and absolutely none of the good news stories. So there's some suggestion that security concerns are kind of a cover for people justifying not wanting to learn new skills. There's a very negative and quite selective view of social media, but at the same time, some of people's comments about social media do make you wish that you went on Facebook less. Sort of comments about people walking around the shops looking at Facebook and going, oh yeah, that's me. And probably one of the most interesting things is this persistent description of internet users as other. Internet users as somehow fundamentally different from the participants. Several participants have picked up my phone and said, I don't need one of these. You might need one of these because you're you and I'm me, but I don't. There's a very clear demarcation in people's minds that internet users are a particular kind of person and they are another kind of person who doesn't want to use the internet or would not benefit from it. So this is interesting in and of itself, but it also has practical implications. It means that when it comes to when we're creating learning materials, when we're creating marketing materials, when we're establishing partnerships, if we know that that's an issue, then we can address it. We can create messages and we can create learning content that try and overcome that misperception. I used to be I started a PhD before I dropped out and jumped into the third sector. Shortly before I did, I talked to a colleague in my department who shall remain nameless, as shall the name of the institution. We were talking about the difference between academia and practical activity. I don't mean to suggest that academia is impractical, far from it, but academia and practice organisations, I suppose. And he said that some people should be thinkers and some people should be doers, which kind of stuck in my mind as one of the most ridiculous things that anybody's ever said to me. Clearly thinking without doing is a bad idea, and doing without thinking is equally bad. So this is why I'm here today. There is still too much division between what research does carry on in the third sector and the action that it should be informed by. There's too much focus on getting the answer that people expect, and there's certainly too little in the way of standardised and scientific approaches. I think even when people in the third sector set off with all of the best intentions in terms of objectivity and in terms of telling it like it is to the boss or the funder or whoever it might be, if their methodology, if the actual methods that they're using aren't right, then what they might be championing and waving under people's noses might be something which is, statistically just too shaky to be usable. So understanding things like, sampling error, margin of error, bias, all of these issues needs to be better understood. So I guess the overall message today is that the third sector needs help from academia. It needs academic support. This doesn't necessarily mean that you should, quit your academic job or your academic career path and jump into a trust or a foundation. It'd be nice if more people did, but there are research opportunities in the third sector for practicing academics from undergraduate level really upwards. We've helped people doing MAs and PhDs to find research projects out across our network. We're increasingly working with academics at professorial level to combine their findings and our findings to produce original insight recommendations. There needs to be more pure research into third sector issues. As I was saying, this is about stepping away from individual projects and looking at the third sector as a whole. There are some really interesting issues. People have probably heard of universal credit. How many people have heard of universal job match by any chance? Universal job match is the job centre's online system for job seekers. Job seekers have to use it. If they don't use it, they can have their benefits sanctioned. This has been in place for 3.5 years now. It's nowhere near as well known as universal credit, but it affects anybody who's claiming JSA or ESA, and the amount of pressure that people can be put under to use this platform can be very intense. As a result, job seekers have been coming to our centres in very, very large numbers. And when they get there, as well as very quickly, the reason they're there in the first place is because they've got a digital skills gap, but the centres tend to find very quickly that they might also not, their CV might be absolutely rubbish. They might have no idea about how to prepare or conduct themselves in an interview. They might have fundamental gaps in skills like literacy and numeracy. They might need advice on qualifications. So this goes back to the idea of the broad spectrum support model that I was talking, and how important and how useful it is, rather than looking at digital skills or literacy or whatever it might be in isolation. The reason I'm mentioning this is we're not funded by the DWP. So we receive funding from other government organisations, trusts and foundations, and centres use it, or some of it at least, to do the DWP's work. Now, that's something that we are continually trying to get looked at, but it would help if there was more pure academic research into this issue and into the fact that the community sector, or large sections of the community sector, are in effect supporting the DWP's agenda for absolutely no money. As I said, improving methodologies on the ground, working with smaller organisations especially to understand the best ways to measure their impact. There are some good, interesting off-the-shelf methodologies. There's things like SROI, but providing a package or an off-the-shelf toolkit that centres can use is useful, but helping third sector organisations to understand the underlying principles of research I think is extremely important as well. Also, it's important to compare results across organisations and projects. You can have, organisations in the northeast and the southeast. They both, they both say we've done very well in these fields, in these areas, across these measures. Are they comparing like with like to be able to find out what are the most cost-effective or effective interventions in terms of results? You need to be able to compare across regions, across projects at different scales. And again, that's something that I think academia has a part in helping with. Before I take any questions, and just to put this slightly more articulately than I can. Oh my goodness, that's enormous. Hold on a second. we have a YouTube channel, and this is just a 3-minute case study of a gentleman called Roger, a user of one of our centres, now a volunteer, and it gives you an idea of the breadth of support that people receive when they attend centres.
I think the start of my homelessness began after the tragic loss of my brother. And I think that's when I started using drugs as a panacea to help heal some of that pain. Mistakenly, I really was lost in a new environment that became more chaotic. Rough sleeping, sofa surfing, staying with relatives for a short period of time until the welcome wore out. Being able to access help, which I did when I came here to St. Mungo's, was the first stage of my real recovery. The training, the IT, discovering UK onlines and just running with it. And it was the support that made me feel encouraged that yes, I can actually recover from this in a wholesome way. I have clients who come in here, multiple barriers. They've been able to get help to start doing something to engage. That in and of itself improves their well-being. They go on to the Learn My Way program, and they didn't realize that a lot of the information can be obtained online. So, I mean, helping them discover these things, I mean, they're treasures. I'm surprised, happily surprised, pleasantly surprised when they come back and say, you know what I found the other day online? Yeah, and there's a link that I can now use. Being able to attain and to stay in work is such a wow factor. It's a happiness factor. That whole sense of, yeah, this is making me better, making me feel better. Acknowledging that and kind of marrying all those elements creates a better person, a well person.
I've met Roger on several occasions, and one thing that doesn't get across is the breadth of support that he's received over the years that he's been with St Mungo's, and also the breadth of the things that he's achieved. It focuses a lot on digital skills because that traditionally has been our remit. It's becoming less of our remit, and one important thing we need to do is start to get case studies which convey more of the richness and diversity of what the network does. Does anyone have any questions? I know that some of you are here for the longitudinal study, and I will answer those as best as I can, although obviously this is about how such methodologies can be implemented in practice or in a practical context. But I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody had. Please.
You talked before about following people, 30 people, I think you said, through 18 months.
Yeah.
Is that 18 months while they're using the service?
It's 18 months from when they're first engaged in the programme.
Is the impact not more about what happens after?
Well, the programme... Sorry, I'm going to get some more water, I'm absolutely parched. The programme's kind of open-ended, and one of the things about our centres is people can generally attend for as long as they want to. So I think the idea is that if they're remaining with the centre for 18 months, within those 18 months there will be, hopefully a tangible positive effect or some effect from the support they've received. If they happen to have moved on, then we're going to make arrangements to speak to them at the centre as neutral ground, and that's happened with one of the participants that I'm interviewing, who's got a job, which is absolutely fantastic. I think one of the things that we want to assess is both the how much the long-term support helps for people who are engaged with it for 18 months or longer. I mean, some older learners attend centres for years. But then if somebody attends for short-term intensive employability support, what effect is that support having, say, 6 months into their new job? Are they using digital skills or literacy skills, for example, that they learned that they learned in that initial period? Maybe the job that they got isn't particularly long-term and they end up coming back to the centre, or they need to find another job, but they then feel equipped and independent and to have the skills they need to update their CV, prepare for interview, what have you, find information. The other thing is, although we are looking at the effect of the support journey, however long or short or simple or complex it might be, this is very much about the stories of people as individuals. We distribute funding from a number of different sources, and the centres that we fund tend to receive multiple pots. So if you're funded to do basic digital skills, we'll also fund you to deliver digital health, and then you're more likely to get funding around providing advice support, because we know that these different pots of funding tend to amplify each other. But by focusing on the stories of the individuals, we hope to be able to find out some ways in which the centres could be helping people better, or ways in which other funded programs could be developed. So yes, it's about the effectiveness of the support they're receiving, but it's also about maybe identifying what they're not receiving, and what could be done differently. Anybody else? Yes, please.
I'm quite interested to hear more about the step wedge trial, how it works.
Okay, I can send you something because I am learning this as I go along. Yeah. I don't feel too bad saying that. We're working with the Behavioural Insights team, which was recently a sort of a unit within government called the Nudge Unit, if anyone's heard of it. They sort of provide insight into how behaviour change can be encouraged through cunning strategies like sending text message reminders to people to update and renew, whatever. They are now an independent organisation. We're working with them on a financial capability programme, partly for their experience in nudging people and encouraging people to work in the right direction, but also for their expertise in stepped wedge trials. We are learning as we go. 3 years ago, we didn't have a research team at all. We had like a guy who did surveys using SurveyMonkey. So one of the things that we do, both through working with organisations like the Behavioural Insights team or academics, is we work with them on programmes, implement methodologies for the first time, and then we know how to do them ourselves. I got in touch with I have an academic colleague who's a senior lecturer in psychology at Sheffield University, and I mentioned step wedges to him. He was like, wow, I've heard of them, but they're very cutting edge. So I can send you some information rather than blathering about it. Anybody else?
Yes. I'm from a country where the third sector is the first sector, because most health and social services are provided by NGOs or third sector organizations, you will name them here in the UK. But my experience about the level of research carried out by the third sector in Belgium is that in some way it has values, because firstly it helps to improve the contact with the local community, which is often lacking for the academic research, which in general target a much broader international community. I think also that the research which has been done by the third sector is also very useful, because it increases accountability, which again is not the main point of academic research. And also I think that research is very interesting in the sense that it is a stronger link with very deprived and difficult to reach groups, which again is not always what academic research is doing with health surveys, census, which target a much broader group. Yet there are two weaknesses I've been seeing of the research carried out by third sector, and I'm not speaking about your work, but
Sure.
I think I'm relating to your point that research needs to be achieved by third sector's organizations.
Mm-hmm.
One is that they lack strong link with the literature. In many cases, the research being done, I'm thinking, for example, about Médecins du Monde, which is a strong NGO in Belgium providing healthcare to undocumented migrants. They have very little interest into the broader literature. So they start from scratch as if nothing had been done before then. So the link of that kind of research with the literature is very poor and quite uneven.
I think that's, sorry, was that?
Yeah. That's the first weakness. And one of the reasons sometimes that they lack access to the big database where these research are being published.
Yeah.
And the second weakness that I do perceive is that these organizations tend to support more small sample, qualitative analysis, which reach obviously is very much local.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you will think that whether these are true weaknesses or are they just the features
I think
the research being done in these organizations?
I think that a third sector researcher that didn't take those things into account would end up with much less robust and interesting findings. I think the point you make about a lack of awareness of the literature is very true, and I think it's pervasive across the third sector, because although there are some very interesting initiatives in independent research in the third sector, finding the time to do the reading can be extremely difficult. I mean, convincing the funder or senior management team that researching what you do is important, and researching it independently and carrying out research that takes place outside of a particular project and doesn't say what a funder wants to hear. That I think is relatively easy. But then having a role where somebody can, we actually have a member of our team who does literature reviews. But when I talked earlier about things like tight timescales and low budgets, we don't, not just, it's like it's consuming the research, it's boiling it down, it's presenting it in the form of briefings that are going to allow things to change very quickly. It's a tough one, and I think it's probably the next step that we need to take. And I think there have been some times when we've conducted research and have made some sort of bold claims about it being groundbreaking, and then found out that there's something else going on over there. And that's not just the case with finding out about academic research. It's the case with finding out about other research that's going on in other parts of the third sector. There needs to be better communication at the top level. The thing you were saying about qualitative research taking place at a relatively small scale, I personally think it's one of it can be a strength, because it can lead to some very interesting deep dive, highly focused qualitative research which might not otherwise take place. But yeah, the issues around broader getting broader numbers and doing quantitative analysis are huge. So our learner survey, which I cited numbers from it earlier, and it's probably only fair to explain to you now that this is an online survey of digital skills. So that straight away tells you that there are going to be some problems with it. Asking people online, do you know how to use a computer, is slightly problematic. We don't have the budget or the logistical capability to deliver an incredibly robust quantitative study across our network. So we do what we can to increase response rates, to try and ensure that samples are a bit more random, and to do things like collecting core demographic data, for example, from all learners when they first register at a centre, and that allows us to correct the more detailed data set to a certain extent. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that this is the best. This is perfect methodology, but it's. I think one of the big challenges is, especially because much more than qualitative data, the quantitative data is what, funding programs and the design of programs is going to be based on. Not just what the problem is, but how widespread is it, where geographically or demographically is it most prevalent. So there are ways to get around it, but until budgets get a lot bigger, and even if budgets get a lot bigger, because we're a second-tier organisation, asking our centres to implement a survey on our behalf becomes incredibly problematic. And then instead of it being a question of, the kind of learners who fill in this online survey are not typical, it becomes the kind of centres that get people to fill in this paper survey are not typical either. So either way, you've got issues of sampling bias. I'm not saying there's an easy solution, but I think there are things to be done. We've been working with Professor Rebecca Einan at Oxford Internet Institute. She overtook an overhaul, just a review of all of our major evaluation interventions over the last year, and she's come up with a lot of useful suggestions about our large-scale surveys and how they could be improved. And it's been an interesting learning process for both of us, where she's made some suggestions. We're like, well, we could do that if we had another 10 million to play with, or we could do that, but then this wouldn't work. And I think she's learned as much about the problems of implementing quantitative methods in a practice context as we have.